Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is October 2018. I thought with this episode we'll focus on something a little bit Halloween oriented. It will be on the Devil's Bible, also known as the Codex Gigas, which is Latin for Big Book. This is literally true as well because it is about 165 pounds or close to 75 kilograms. It is 3 feet in height, almost 2 feet across, and almost 1 foot thick. And it requires 2 people to pick it up and carry it. It is currently located at a library in Stockholm, Sweden. In order to sort of set the scene for this, though, we will also have to talk about Rudolf II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was also the King of Bohemia and Hungary. The odd thing about him is not only did he possess the Codex Gigas, but he also had the Voynich manuscript as well. Both of these texts are what are known as illuminated manuscripts. That means that they have various drawings and portraiture in the marginalia outside of the text. The Voynich manuscript was produced later than the Codex Gigas. The Codex Gigas appears to be from the 1200s, and the Voynich manuscript is from the early 1400s. However, both did, apparently from everything that I can find, end up in the library of Rudolf II. The Voynich manuscript is composed of a largely indecipherable text. There have been many attempts over the hundreds of years to decrypt it, but I actually think that gets to the heart of the problem with the Voynich manuscript is that I don't think that it is an encrypted text. I actually think it is an entirely separate language that they just have not looked into yet. That is not the subject of this particular episode, so I will concentrate on that one later. I'm actually writing an article to go along with this that will go into more depth in terms of names, dates, and places and all that sort of stuff, to sort of set the historical aspect a little bit more solidly than I'll be able to do in this podcast and episode. I do have PDF copies of both of these, the Codex Gigas and the Voynich manuscript, so I will associate images with that for those who are able to follow along on the video. The Codex Gigas seems to be popular and rather well known, or infamous anyway, for 3 different reasons. The primary one would be because of a portrait that appears in there of the devil. And this is a rather unusual depiction of the devil himself because it shows him all alone in a very large room, possibly in his abode of hell. This is odd because during this time period, typical depictions of the devil would show him with other demons, or they would show him punishing humans in some fashion, and usually hell would be divided into multiple levels, and none of those things appear in this particular case. Opposite of that page, however, is a depiction of heaven, which is shown to be actually about the same size as the devil. This, I guess, is supposed to show the strength and power of El Diablo, and heaven is actually divided up into different sections, and there are different living quarters depicted there, angels and humans and all these different things. And the portrait does cast a rather menacing figure, to be sure. It does have the forked tongue that we've become familiar with over time. It also has horns. There are claws on both the hands and the feet. And he's dressed in only a loincloth, which is purportedly made out of ermine, which was something commonly used in portrait depictions at the time to show someone who was of regal authority or one who was of great power. A lot of this imagery shows the way that the pagan belief systems and the heretic beliefs of Europe had influenced Christian depictions of Satan. Because if you go back in time to the original versions of, say, Satan or Shaitan, you see very different depictions, more along the lines of a standard demon imagery, and not so much in terms of the horns and the claws that you find on animals, the cloven feet, the hooves, and all this kind of stuff that came along later, usually out of associations with Pan. It isn't my personal favorite depiction of Satan. That one would be the one that they used in Red Dragon. In fact, when I showed my daughter this particular picture, she looked at it and she said, "It's kind of scary and it's kind of funny." And that's how I feel about it as well. I mean, I think I do see the frightening aspects of it. You can see that it would be seen that way back then, but also it's a little bit comical compared to some of the things that we've seen both before it and after it. but I think it's pretty easy to see how that is one of the three sources for how it came to be nicknamed the Devil's Bible. Now, the other one, which is also very well known, is that it was supposedly created in a single night by a monk named Herman. And this monk was in trouble within his monastery for breaking some unknown set of his monastic vows, and he was to be basically walled in probably until he died, one would assume. And this is something that was found in Edgar Allan Poe's A Cask of Amontillado, the bricking up of the person and all this. So anyway, he made a pact during the night, I guess around midnight, something like that, the witching hour, to produce this text that was to honor the monastery, at least that's what he told them, with a compilation or a synthesis of all of human knowledge up until that point. And they said, well, if you're able to accomplish this task, then we will set you free and you won't be walled up and, into your death and all of this. And he made a pact, however, in order to complete this, sort of a Faustian deal with the devil himself. He would exchange his soul in order to be able to complete this task. Now, that's, not a very good exchange if you actually think about it, but supposedly that's what happened. And then once they came to retrieve him from his quarters the next day, he had completed this extraordinarily large 165-pound book that was over 300 pages long. There's another version of the legend that says that it wasn't in a single night that this was produced, that he was given an entire year, but it was on the night before it was due. He realized that he would never be able to complete it, so he broke down in prayer and said a prayer not to God, but to Satan, that if he would manifest himself and provide him with the help to complete it, then he could have his soul in exchange. And that sort of brings us to the third source for how this came to be known as the Devil's Bible, and that is because it supposedly contained another text that has since been removed. Now, there are missing pages from this. Anywhere from 10 to 12 pages are estimated to be missing. Now, historians commonly say that this contained something about, say, the Benedictine order or some of the monastic orders' rites and rituals and vows and all this sort of stuff, and that it was removed for those reasons, and they didn't want other people to have them. But others say that not only was that missing, that would only take up, say, a page and a half, 2 pages, maybe 2.5 pages in total. So there are an unaccounted number of pages, and other people say that these other missing pages were indeed a version of the devil's prayer, a prayer to the devil that this monk Herman had said. And that alone would almost transition this illuminated manuscript over into a classical grimoire, because it would be a magic spell in terms of conjuration. It would be able to conjure the devil himself, almost like you see in the movie The Ninth Gate, and also a book that was made before that. And as intriguing as all that is, before we get into the rest of the historical aspects of this and the investigations that have been done on it later by graphologists and paleographers and all sorts of other experts, we should look back, I think, to Rudolf II himself and his court. Now, Rudolf had a very interesting court, and a lot of this is what brought these texts in to him. Now, he was of mixed parentage. He had a Habsburg background and Spanish background. He was primarily raised and taught inside of a Spanish court. And the Spanish court systems, for those who don't know, during this time, during, say, the 16th and 17th century, it was a very restricted sort of a court. It was very, shall we say, conservative in their manners and the way that people had to be brought in and presented before the king and all of this. However, when you switch over to the Habsburg side, they were a lot more interesting. They were very, I guess you would say, unorthodox, I guess. They were much more open-minded. This was the period of the Renaissance when things were much more cosmopolitan than they had been before. And Rudolf himself was particularly oriented this way. I mean, he was very into toleration and openness, and because he had been exposed to 3 different versions of Christianity at this point, the Orthodox version, the Catholic version, and the Protestant version, he actually did not have too much interest in any of the 3. In fact, he was much more into what are known as the occult sciences, into mysticism, the Hermetic arts, into Kabbalah, and that is both the Christian version of Kabbalah and the Jewish version of Kabbalah. And Rudolf was really a great exemplar of this entire period where people tried to bring together and synthesize all knowledge that had existed prior to that, which is an odd thing that it has in common with the Codex Gigas itself, because that indeed is what that monk was attempting to do. And that is actually what Rudolf ended up doing on his own later. And this brings me around to something that often frustrates me among people today who are idolaters, basically, of the Enlightenment period, is they forget all of those things that came before. They just try to dismiss it as the Dark Ages and that those people were ignorant and backwards and they didn't know anything. And really, they don't even seem to understand that the Enlightenment was actually built on many of the things that were taking place during this Renaissance period. Because there were all of these, say, mystical forms of Neoplatonism that were going on back then, but you also have to look at how, say, alchemy led over into chemistry and how astrology led over into astronomy. Now, they don't like to admit that a lot of their origins actually were rooted in these things. In fact, you can even trace back some of the notions about evolution to these time periods here where you're talking about alchemy and all of this, because they would talk about it in terms of a transmutation of species, which is akin to the searches for the Philosopher's Stone, the elixir of life, the elixir of youth, the transmutation of base metals into gold, and all of those oriented things. The idolaters of the Enlightenment have tried to expurgate much of their own history. They don't want to realize that a lot of it was brought about by people like Rudolf II, who, although he was into all of this occult stuff, he was also a patron of the arts and sciences. He brought in all of these artifacts from anywhere that he could get them. Sculptures, beautiful works of art, clocks. He brought in clock makers. He brought in astronomers, astrologers as well. It's been contended that a lot of its interest in this was spurred because of an astrological horoscope that had been prepared for him by Nostradamus that predicted, he thought, many things that came to be true in his life later. So with this, he ended up forming his court around these kinds of ideas and these kinds of people. He's also said to have personally engaged in various types of research into alchemy. I would guess that it probably also involves some mercury, because a lot of these experiments involved mercury, and that happened and was true all the way up until the time of Isaac Newton. Rudolf, in fact, brought in 2 astronomers to his court who were highly influenced by the Copernican model, and those would be Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. Some have even said that many aspects of modern cosmology were born very much out of this entire environment that was taking place in Rudolf's court. And among the things that they were commonly interested in at this time were notions such as harmony, balance, order, and they also were very interested in producing or attaining various items of supposedly magical power, such as talismans and ancient relics, and these could be both occult relics or Christian relics. A lot of this stuff, too, you see turning up again and again in terms of the Habsburg royal family, where they ended up having at least one of either 3 or one of 5 versions of the Spear of Destiny or the Spear of Longinus. Many of the books at this time were often laden with calligraphy. They were also often encoded. They were often transported around under secrecy. These were things that were of the highest levels of importance for both kings and other members in their court. And the Renaissance was really a time that was kind of a brief interval for the occult sciences where they could flourish a little more openly than they had been able to do in the past. Obviously, they still had to operate in secret as much as possible, but once the Enlightenment came along and it expurgated so much of the occult sciences, it ended up driving them underground because of the emphasis on naturalism and rationalism. And many historians have said that this focus on Enlightenment rationalism, once it was combined with 2 different versions of humanism, both Christian humanism and later secular humanism, it really represented a sort of closing off of so many of these things that we had in the past. And since Rudolf was such a voracious and obsessive collector of different things, he had this sort of polyglot milieu of interests. He loved symbols and symbolism, and he belonged to a chivalric order that was known as the Order of the Golden Fleece. And he ran a very open court and had a very permissive attitude there. And he never married himself. He actually had a whole series of mistresses and consorts, ladies of the night. Some have said that he had male consorts as well. But because of this litany of concubines, he had all kinds of rumors that came up about him, especially among the Catholics. They said that he was into demonology, he was into worship of Satan, that he was possibly even possessed later in his life as he began to become more reclusive and pull himself more and more away from the world. In fact, he rarely left the castle the last few years of his life. But his true love was never religion of any sort, not from anything that I can find. He was mainly in love with the arts and sciences and their occult variants. And occult, for those who don't know, does not necessarily mean satanic or Luciferian in this context. It simply means hidden. Many historians say, though, because of his lax leadership, this ended up leading to the 30 Years' War. And eventually, Prague itself was sacked by the Swedes, and they were able to take away an entire treasure trove of all of these exquisitely rare works that he had. He had collected things from all across northern Africa, the Near East, and of course Europe. Now, certainly most of this material has never been recovered, but it's estimated that only about 15% of the artwork that he had was explicitly Christian in a religious sense. But he had lots and lots of hermetic materials and occult materials, but it was all just a magnificent and ostentatious displays. They say that some of this was influenced from his exposure to the Spanish courts. Although they were more conservative in nature, he just transferred that over to a different type of resplendent splendor, shall we say. But not only he and many other people of influence during that time were becoming reconnected with the ancient world, with the Babylonians, with the Chaldeans, and with the Egyptians, and with their various mythologies and legends that surrounded their cultures and societies. Historically, I think that Rudolf II is somewhat of a neglected character. I personally don't recall hearing very much about him when I was in graduate school studying European history. But I do find it very intriguing how he's able to connect us to Nostradamus, also to the Spear of Longinus, and also to the Voynich manuscript, and to the Codex Gigas, all in one person. It all sort of just comes together with his court and his very strange menagerie of people who were coming and going during those periods. Now, as we transition over from Rudolf II to the Codex Gigas itself, there have never been any serious questions about its authenticity, which is something that differentiates it from the Voynich manuscript. There have been accusations for many, many years that the Voynich manuscript was one which was forged either by Wilfrid Voynich himself, which I certainly do not believe, or that it had been done so during the time of Rudolf, which I also reject for a whole series of reasons that I'll get into both in the article and in the video that will focus on the Voynich manuscript. But as to the Codex Gigas itself, it is very much a real document, but there are all these questions that came about over time about, how many people were involved in its production, how was it actually manufactured, how was it put together, and it is made out of vellum, which is what was used at the time, which means that the sheets were typically made out of animal skin, usually donkeys or calf skins. And I think once they performed the tests on this, they found out that it was indeed from calf skins. And the manuscript itself, of course, is enormous. It contains almost the entirety of the Latin Vulgate Bible. It was actually incomplete in and of itself, but this was constructed originally, for those who don't know, in the 4th century by Jerome. But it wasn't an official Catholic text until the 16th century. In addition to the Vulgate Bible, it also included some of the works of Josephus, like the Antiquities of the Jews. It also had Isidore of Seville's encyclopedia known as Etymologia. It had a whole collection of what are known as Ars Medicinae, or medical works. Oddly enough, once the National Geographic got together a series of historians and other experts, they were indeed able to confirm at least part of the legend related to Hermann. It indeed does seem to have been written by a single person. However, of course, it is impossible that this was done in a single night or even in a single year. In fact, when they performed writing tests on it, they found that just for the writing portions alone, not the artwork and the illuminated margins and whatnot, would have taken 5 years of around-the-clock writing just to complete that aspect. So it is thought that once you toss in all of the duties of a monk that were typical of this time period, and the painting as well, that this expands the time frame to a minimum of 15 years to complete. And mostly the experts said that they would be more comfortable with a time frame on the range of 20, 25, or perhaps even 30 years for the production of this text. Now, some of the odd things they found about it is that there are no obvious signs of erasures or corrections of errors that were made. There are also signs that this was done by a single person's hand, but that there had been no deterioration in hand-eye coordination or in eyesight over time that would be typical, that you would expect, taking place over a 25 or 30-year period. So that is rather incredible in and of itself. Now, there are some additional oddities to this text that often does not come up in the documentaries about it or when people are writing about it. So one of the things that appears is that there are various exorcisms given in there, but the odd thing with these exorcisms is they many times actually provide the names of specific demons. This is something that was also not common at that time. Like I said before, with the depiction of Satan in a single room by himself, that is not common, and it is also not common to provide at this particular time period the names of certain demons. Another thing that I personally found strange is that the depiction of the devil himself falls on what is known as the recto page, or the right page. Now, all throughout this medieval period, it was always thought that the left-hand side was the side of darkness, it was the side of the fallen, it was the side of the evil. And that is where, when you open up the folios, you find the depiction of heaven. It's on the left-hand side, Satan is on the right-hand side. So that's a little bit of an oddity. It's also rather miraculous that the book was even able to survive. In fact, there was a large castle fire at one point where it was housed, and then a person, supposedly one person anyway, took the book and threw it out of a window, where it fell down and landed on a person who I'm sure was injured quite badly by the Codex Gigas, weighing 165 pounds. So as to the mystery around it with this apocryphal text of the Devil's Prayer, who knows? Who's to say? I do wish that that could be located at some point. I would like to know, how that could be found and how you cover up a text that would be that large. It would have to be folded and hidden away somewhere. At least one of the larger mysteries about it was also solved by that National Geographic investigation. The historians were able to find that the Herman, the monk who wrote it, name was supposedly Herman Inclusus, which had earlier been interpreted that he was going to be walled up in terms of a certain type of punishment that was common at the time called inclusus. But they actually found that in this particular context, what it meant was Herman the Recluse. So he ended up having that in common with Rudolf II as well. In addition to the Latin calligraphy that it has and a Latin alphabet, it also has a Greek and Hebrew alphabet and two different versions of Slavic alphabets. I do find it rather surprising that neither the book, The Club Dumas, nor The Ninth Gate, in terms of the film, made any kind of a reference to the Codex Gigas, especially since the focus of both of those was the concept of a book that contained some aspect of it that was oriented around instructions for summoning up or conjuring the devil. It would seem to me, anyway, that just this legend of the Devil's Prayer would have been a natural to have inserted in either of those. Much has been made over the years about the portrait of the devil that's in the Codex Gigas, primarily because there's a darkening of that particular page. But one of the things that's common to vellum itself is that the more that it's exposed to light or ultraviolet light, meaning the more that it's opened to a specific page, the more that people came and looked at that particular oddity in the book, that is what caused that discoloration. They used to think that it was caused by the fire in the castle, and that this had some kind of dark references or whatever to the picture itself, as if the smoke were drawn to that particular picture, but that is not the case. It's just a consequence that it's made out of vellum. That being said, I do find it extraordinarily interesting, very, very fascinating, but still to me the Voynich manuscript is even more interesting, and I'm very excited to move on with that episode next. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.